Right now we're in Lynn Canal headed north. Just happens every week up here.
Alaska, today a vital part of the United States, was once a Russian outpost, and its story holds some surprising twists. Did you know that centuries ago, Eurasia and North America were physically linked by a land bridge? This bridge, called Beringia, was the path for the first humans to enter North America around 14,000 years ago. Fast forward to the 18th century. Russia expanded into Alaska, but despite early hopes, survival proved impossible. By 1867, the Russian Empire sold it to the United States for just $7.2 million. This video dives deep into Alaska's history, from its Russian roots to its complex present. Now first, like always, be sure to hit the like button down below. It helps us out tremendously with the reach of this video. Thank you. It's fascinating how history reveals connections we might never expect. Did you know that Alaska, now a cornerstone of North America, was once part of the Russian Empire? But the story goes much deeper. There was a time when Eurasia and North America were physically joined. Imagine a world without the Bering Strait, replaced instead by a vast land bridge known as Beringia. This bridge, a gateway for life, is believed to have been the path for some of the earliest people to step into North America. Scientists tell us Beringia first emerged around 35,700 years ago. At times, it stretched like the tundra of northern Alaska, bustling with large mammals, but the climate was merciless. The land bridge often lay encased in impenetrable ice, opening briefly between 24,500 and 22,000 years ago, and again from 16,400 to 14,800 years ago. It was during one of these fleeting windows, about 14,000 years ago, that early humans are thought to have made their crossing. Picture the world then. Sea levels were far lower, uncovering miles of coastlines along Siberia and Alaska. These exposed shores became silent witnesses to migration, though today they rest buried beneath layers of sediment. Still, evidence whispers of those journeys. Genetic studies trace the first arrivals to ancient northern Siberians and East Asians, mingling roughly 20,000 to 23,000 years ago. While theories diverge on some details, one truth holds firm. Humanity found its way to North America across this ancient path. Centuries later, another crossing occurred, this time driven by conquest. In the mid-18th century, while British colonists established footholds on the east coast, Russia claimed the far northwest. Fresh from victory in the Great Northern War, the Russian Empire, under leaders like Peter the Great, sought to expand. Their gaze turned eastward to the Pacific, the Aleutian Islands, and the untamed lands of Alaska. A bold step in humanity's endless journey to explore and connect. It wasn't just about land, it was about protecting a lifeline, the pulse of an empire. Peter the Great understood this well, for the fur trade poured more than 10% of Russia's wealth into its heart. For years, the whispers of treasures beyond the eastern frontier called to daring explorers. In 1725, it was Vitus Bering, a Danish navigator, who answered this call under the Russian crown. What he found was nothing short of breathtaking. Siberia stretched beyond imagination, meeting the Arctic's icy embrace. His charts traced unknown coasts, and though the journey was perilous, it hinted at a future full of promise. Though not the first Russian subject to set foot in Alaska, Bering's expeditions laid the foundation for what was to come. He confirmed the closeness of Siberia and Alaska, separated only by a narrow strait, one that now bears his name. Tragically, he never witnessed the full scope of his discoveries, succumbing to scurvy in 1741, leaving behind a legacy that would shape history. By 1741, the veil had lifted, revealing Alaska to European eyes. Russian traders, driven by the dwindling fur reserves in Siberia, launched voyage after voyage into these icy, unyielding waters. More than 40 expeditions between 1740 and 1800 returned with bountiful hauls, each success kindling the empire's hunger for more. In 1784, Gregory Shilov, a Siberian fur trader, established the first permanent Russian settlement, 3 Saints Bay on Kodiak Island. This bustling outpost housed 200 settlers and became the launchpad for deeper exploration. Yet the land held stories older than Russia's ambitions, with Native American tribes inhabiting the area centuries earlier. The local communities resisted fiercely. Tlingit warriors drove Russians from their posts in 1802, only to see them return 2 years later. Farms, forts, sawmills, and even mines soon dotted Alaska's landscape, each an echo of the Empire's relentless pursuit of dominion in the frozen north. The map once painted a hopeful picture of Russian settlements in Alaska, but beneath it lay a harsh truth. Survival was a daily struggle. The bitter cold and isolation made life unbearable difficult. Food supplies, mostly from Siberia, were scarce and often spoiled, leaving the settlers on the brink of starvation. By 1806, they were desperately hanging on. Driven by this desperation, they ventured south in search of food and new opportunities, eventually reaching California and establishing another colony. But even there, the relentless push of expansion couldn't stop the unraveling of Alaska's fortunes. Overhunting had already wiped out the sea otters, draining the fur trade's profits, while other powers eyed the Russian Empire with growing suspicion. By 1862, the Emperor knew the time had come to reassess. The Russian-American company's mandate was not renewed, and just a few years later, Alaska was sold to the United States for $7.2 million. While that amount might seem insignificant, adjusting for inflation, it's closer to $153 million today, according to some sources, although others estimate it at $119 million. It's clear that the value was much different back then. When the deal was finalized, President Johnson appointed General Leveille H. Rousseau to oversee the transfer of power. On October 18th, he arrived in Alaska, and later that day, the Russian flag was lowered, replaced by the American one. Both Russian and American troops were present, along with a few native leaders, marking the moment as one of peaceful transition. Most Russians who had lived in Alaska weren't permanent residents, and so they returned to their homeland. Some stayed though, and they were given the chance to apply for US citizenship within 3 years. The land was vast, 586,000 square miles, twice the size of Texas. But despite its immense size, Alaska was not seen as a valuable acquisition by many. The deal was mockingly dubbed Seward's Folly, after William Seward, the US Secretary of State who negotiated the purchase. Skeptics, led by Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, scorned it, calling the land a barren wasteland, unworthy of the price. Yet, despite the ridicule and skepticism, there were reasons the Russian Empire decided to sell. The truth, perhaps, lies hidden beneath the surface of those early criticisms. And as history unfolded, the world would come to realize that Alaska's value was far greater than anyone could have imagined. In the vast, untamed expanse of Alaska, uncertainty once held the land in its grip. A small Russian community, barely a few hundred strong, survived only through the support of local tribes and foreign powers, the British and the Americans. Despite their efforts, the colony could never truly thrive. The endless wilderness felt like a distant dream, and Russian officials feared losing it to the encroaching powers. What if the Americans took it? Or worse, the British, freshly victorious over Russia in the Crimean War? The once thriving fur trade had dwindled, and with a crumbling empire, Alaska became a burden. In 1867, the decision came. Selling it felt like the only way forward. But to whom? The British were out of the question. The United States, though not the obvious choice, seemed the lesser evil. Perhaps Russia saw the US as a counter to British dominance, or maybe it was simply an opportunity to profit before the inevitable. For $7.2 million, Alaska changed hands, a sum worth $119 million today. At the time, it was barely noticed, the land uncharted and forgotten. But when gold was discovered just across the border, everything changed. A rush of fortune seekers transformed Alaska from a quiet backwater into a thriving frontier. By 1899, gold was discovered around Nome, and prospectors flooded the region, quickly establishing over 50 gold mining camps. Some of these camps, like Nome and Fairbanks, grew into thriving cities. The creation of the Alaskan Railroad between 1915 and 1923 connected these camps to major ports, and anchorage grew around the railroad's base. The Russian presence in Alaska, once so real, now felt like a distant memory, though many traces of it remained in the form of buildings and religious heritage. But there is a part of the story we must never forget: the indigenous people of Alaska, who lived there long before any colonial powers claimed the land. Their presence remained constant despite the shifting flags of empires. As the population surged, particularly during the gold rush, the land, now undeniably tied to the United States, began to fill with settlers. The gender imbalance in the population, driven by the male-dominated rush for gold, persisted into the 20th century. It wasn't until much later, in the 2000s, that this ratio finally began to level out. The Russian settlement in Alaska began with high hopes, but quickly sank into hardship. The settlers, enduring harsh conditions, often found their supplies spoiled or never arriving. By 1806, they were on the brink of starvation. Desperate, they expanded southward, even reaching California, but the land they hoped would save them proved unforgiving. In 1862, the emperor, witnessing the failure, ended the Russian-American company's mandate. A few years later, Alaska was sold to the United States. What seemed like a lost cause would eventually reveal itself as a hidden treasure, offering unimaginable wealth. In 1880, Alaska's population was just 33,042. By 1900, it nearly doubled to 63,592. But after the gold rush, a wave of people left, and the population fell. Yet, in the 1940s, the state began to change rapidly, growing stronger year by year, doubling or adding hundreds of thousands in just a decade. But what happened to the money from selling Alaska? There's a story that the funds went into buying railroad equipment. It makes sense, as Russia was building railroads at the time and faced shortages. Yet, some believe the money was lost when the ship Orne sank during a storm. However, records tell a different tale. The Russian State Archive reveals that Russia received over 11 million rubles for the land, most of which funded the railway project. Of course, there was also a reward. Eduard Stukel, involved in the deal, received $25,000 and a pension. Today, Alaska's wealth is undeniable, with its natural resources, oil, gold, fish, and so much more. These have helped the state thrive without taxes, even offering an annual stipend to every resident. The US paid a small price for such riches, especially when compared to the cost of a courthouse in New York. And now, in the heart of it all, Alaska Day is celebrated every October 18th, a proud reminder of how much this land has given. In 1867, something momentous happened. Alaska was handed over to the United States, and the flag-raising ceremony that took place on this day remains a vivid memory. For many, this is a time for celebration, parades, floats, marching bands, and costumes that take us back to the 1860s, all filled with a sense of joy and unity. But for some, this day isn't a cause for celebration. It's a reminder of how the land they called home for 10,000 years was taken from them. The indigenous people of Alaska never had a say in the deal, and they are still fighting for justice. Activists argue that the Russian Empire didn't have the right to sell land that didn't belong to them, making the entire transaction illegal. But who are we to judge what happened so long ago? Time doesn't heal all wounds, especially when you've been stripped of your home. The struggle is not just about history, it's about the present. Native tribes are still facing challenges today. One of Alaska's tribes recently found itself in a legal battle over the overfishing of herring, a vital food source. The state's interference threatened their right to subsist on the land and waters that have sustained them for generations. There's also the ongoing fight to protect the Tongass National Forest, where efforts to reinstate the roadless rule are under threat. The list of challenges goes on, yet the wheels of justice seem to turn slowly. Greenland, a land that once seemed distant to the United States, was quietly desired long ago. In 1814, Denmark took control through a treaty, yet the US kept its gaze fixed on the untouched expanses. Through the years, despite shifting priorities, Greenland's significance grew. Military bases anchored its importance, and its strategic position became undeniable. But in 2019, when the US proposed to purchase it, Denmark's Prime Minister dismissed the idea as absurd. Even in 2024, the dream lingers, with figures like Donald Trump reigniting the debate, though Greenland's Prime Minister firmly declared, Greenland is not for sale. Still, the doors to cooperation remain open. And then, just south, a different story unfolds. Puerto Rico, a Caribbean jewel long under US control, still doesn't hold the title of statehood. Though its people are citizens, they lack the right to vote in federal elections. But in late 2022, hope sparked when a bill passed in the House, offering the people the chance to choose their future. Yet, when it didn't pass the Senate, the dream faded. But the spirit of Puerto Rico, alive and strong, rose again in 2024. With 57% of the people voting for statehood, their voices echoed clearly, change is coming. And that's where we'll leave it for today, the fascinating history of Alaska, from its Russian roots to becoming part of the United States, and the untold stories of its indigenous people. History has a way of connecting the dots in ways we can never predict, but one thing is certain: the past shapes the present, and the future will continue to unfold. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Until next time, keep exploring and stay curious.